Welcome to the AFSA podcast. I'm Dana, and today I'm joined by Nathan McGovern from Animal Rising, a UK-based animal rights movement known for bold, high-profile campaigns. Animal Rising has been at the forefront of public attention in the UK for its campaign against the breeding and use of beagles for research, including the MBR Acres facility, which breeds thousands of beagle puppies each year for animal testing. Their campaign has shone the spotlight on a system that operates largely out of sight. In 2022, Animal Rising conducted an open rescue operation involving several beagles from MBR Acres. That action resulted in convictions and jail sentences for some of those involved and sparked major debate in the UK about animal testing, protest, and the legal boundaries of activism. It's a live and highly charged issue with potential implications for future laws and advocacy. Today, we're going to talk about all of that, the ethical, legal, and scientific implications, and what it means for movements like AFSA and other animal advocates. Welcome, Nathan.
Cool, thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Let's start with an introduction. Please tell us about yourself and how you came to work for Animal Rising.
Yes, so I think my story is not a particularly original one. I had quite a normal upbringing. I grew up in a city called Coventry, which is about 400,000 people. Most notable probably for getting bombed to smithereens during the Second World War. So yeah, grew up in a nice kind of happy family home, parents, two siblings. Actually originally wanted to be a veterinary surgeon when I was growing up. But then realized when I started doing chemistry A level that maybe chemistry wasn't for me. So kind of did like a full pivot as I was going through my studies when I was like 16, 17, 18, and then eventually ended up studying philosophy and theology at university with a particular focus on political and moral philosophy alongside logic as well, which kind of like led me into a lot of like thinking about the state of the world, politics, society, where we're going. And then in 2020 took that step into veganism, which kind of I think has guided the trajectory of the rest of my life since then. Ended up moving to London to do a master's degree in 2021. Became surrounded by at the time Extinction Rebellion, Animal Rebellion, as Animal Rising used to be called, and just kind of fell headfirst into the space of really politically active people who weren't only turning up to vote every 4 years, they were actually getting out and doing something and advocating on a huge, wide platform. As it was at the time. Of course, Extinction Rebellion has kind of died a little bit of a death since then, but at the time it was absolutely booming. So never really looked back from there. And then as I was doing my master's, started volunteering for Animal Rebellion, as it was at the time, and then steadily took on more responsibility. My kind of background within Animal Rising and Animal Rebellion is in press and media, narrative communications work rather than anything else. And as I say, we kind of took these steps into running these like big direct action campaigns through 2022, 23, 24, all the way up to now, whilst also becoming more familiar with like narrative side of things, which I find absolutely fascinating, of like how do you deliver a message in a way that's going to appeal to its audience, which is something that I think is in general the animal movement, whether it's direct action, civil disobedience, advocacy, effective altruism, doesn't spend enough time doing, which is kind of a bit of a hint of the big takeaways that I've had over the past few years. And now kind of in a position where my life is being spent working on animal issues, in particular the campaign that we have at the moment to shut down MBR Acres and rehome the dogs. So it's a situation that I kind of fell into through a mixture of luck and my own curiosity, with a few arrests mixed in along the way. But it's not something that I don't think I would change it for the world where I am now.
Yeah, it's a very unique path, but it sounds just as impactful for the animals, if not more.
Yes, I think so. And I'm very happy to be where I am now. And I hope that the actions and the campaigns that I've helped to launch and guide along the way have made a difference. And of course, rescuing beagle puppies from MBR Acres was directly saving animal lives. It wasn't in the abstract, which made it even more special to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to know, because Animal Rising to me appears as an organization that's primarily against factory farming. So why was animal testing chosen as a focus, and why specifically MBR Acres?
Yes, so this is a really interesting question that comes up a lot for us because on the face of it, it seems like a very much a tangent to the other work that we're doing. And I suppose to answer this, you need to go back to when Animal Rebellion began. This is back in like 2019, 2020. As I said, this was when Extinction Rebellion, the kind of global climate movement, was really at its peak, at its heyday. And that was where Animal Rising began, was seeing that the climate movement has all this momentum, all this people right now, and this is a place that the animal movement can make a tangible difference and begin inserting a new message into the climate space. Because as we all know, the climate space is dominated by the conversation of fossil fuels, and that is what 99% of people think of when you say climate change, climate crisis, global warming. But as a lot of people now know, like animal farming and fishing, particularly factory farming, are just as bad, if not worse, for the planet than fossil fuels. So the idea, in a nutshell, was basically like climate is the strategy and animals are the heart. So yeah, joining in the climate movement. So that was kind of why the focus was on animal farming at the beginning. But there was always this desire to do some more animal forward, animal focused things along the way, but only if it made sense within this kind of like paradigm that had been set up. And I think we saw from 2021 until probably the end of 2022 that the climate message was the climate message was an incredibly powerful one in the UK. It was making up a lot of ground. We saw the relative success of Extinction Rebellion in getting the British government to declare a climate emergency. We saw Insulate Britain eventually win their demand for the government to be rolling out insulation schemes across the UK. But the longer it went on and the more kind of very radical direct action that was happening, the harsher the consequences became for the people involved, as you can imagine, but also the tolerance for the public for these people and therefore their message was really starting to wear thin. And we got to a point, particularly with Just Stop Oil in this country in 2022, where anything climate related was suddenly like absolutely anathema for the government to touch, because climate and climate issues have been associated with this like law-breaking minority of people that it's very easy to demonize. And whether rightly or wrongly, of course, at that point, it just stopped gaining traction in the public consciousness. So it was this period through 2022 and into 2023 where our message really fundamentally shifted to be an animal forward one, of course, maintaining the climate because it's such a powerful logical argument first of all, but also a very emotional one if you play it right. But focusing on animals really was the heart of what we were doing, and it felt right. And the rescue of beagles from MBR Acres, the first of which happened in June 2022, was the first time that this was like really forefronted in what we were doing. And I think it's proven to be massively successful ever since in building this base of support for the work that we're doing, and also pushing this message to the British public. And moving on to MBR Acres specifically, it's, I would say, is the biggest symbol of animal testing in the UK, as far as the animal movement is considered, but probably also for the public as well. So MBR Acres was formerly known as Interfauna, I believe, and it's a facility that's been in this location for decades. It is, at the moment, the only facility in the UK that breeds dogs, beagle puppies, for animal testing. So again, it's really like kind of talismanic, symbolic value in that as well. And of course, dogs are probably the animal that people can relate to the most and have the most empathy for, perhaps besides, animals like monkeys as well. So the idea of like taking on a very symbolic like element of the animal testing industry felt very important. And if this is a struggle that we can win, that the rest of the animal testing industry will be easier to beat down the line. I think both sides of this kind of fight, if you want to call it that, recognise the strategic and symbolic importance of MBR Acres. And it's a site where there's a long history of protest, of activism. It was the place where in the 90s, the Animal Liberation Front rescued beagles from as well. The rescue in 2022 was the first rescue since then, which we're very proud of. And of course, we've got this like history of like anti-animal testing action in the UK with the Animal Liberation Front, with SHAC, with Speak, in varying capacities, and also now Camp Beagle, who've been outside the gates of MBR for 4, maybe 5 years now. So it's really the idea that like being bold and kind of going a bit out of your comfort zone, alongside the fact that this is the symbol of animal testing in the UK. If you can beat this one, you can beat anything.
Yeah. And coming back to that rescue in 2022, so it was you and 19 others from Animal Rising, and you broke into MBR Acres and rescued 23 beagle puppies. I'd like to hear more about the decision making that led up to that. How did you decide that that was the right course of action, and how long had you been planning it? And, were there moments that you were hesitant or regretful?
Yes, so to break it down a bit further, so in 2022 there was 2 rescues from MBR Acres that we did. The first one was in June 2022 with 3 people who rescued 5 beagle puppies, and then in December where 18 of us rescued 18 dogs, and there was 1 person overlap between the two for a total of 20 people. And in June, what happened was that the day before, it was just planned as like a protest kind of occupation of MBR Acres, somewhere that's really difficult to get into, the public haven't seen the inside of. Logic was going onto the property, trespassing onto the property, and filming and showing exactly the conditions that the dogs are living in, because this is a very important thing that people have a right to be aware of. And through that kind of process, some of the people who did this protest, did this occupation, were so moved by what they saw on that day that they decided the next day, as soon as they were released from a police station, to go back and to attempt to rescue dogs from this facility. It's like very urgent, like defense of life, basically, which I think is like a very beautiful way of putting it. And it is certainly what a jury will hear when they go to trial, is this absolute necessity that these people felt after seeing firsthand the conditions inside, to go back and do it. And I think that rescue didn't go off without a hitch, as you can imagine, being done a little bit in the spur of the moment, a little bit kind of ragtag, but they did manage to successfully rescue 5 dogs who are now living in safe, loving family homes. And this was one of the biggest things, I think, for the UK animal movement in years. This facility, as I said, is like symbolic of animal testing in the UK. It's been the target of so much protest for decades in this country, and dogs hadn't been rescued from there since the 1990s. So this was like 20 years later, a group going in and doing this openly, not attempting to hide what they'd done as well, was so powerful for the animal movement of the UK. And that spurred us on to plan a larger rescue in December, which definitely was pre-planned as a rescue. It wasn't, it wasn't the spur of the moment attempt. It was very much designed to rescue as many dogs as possible on the day, but to also raise as much awareness of the site as possible, which I think is a really important factor. Is there's 2,000 dogs at any given time at MBR Acres. You're never going to be able to rescue them all at once, sadly. But what you can do is rescue as many as you can on the day, and hope that you can speed along whatever legislative changes that you need to make sure the others can be rehomed safely, as well. So yeah, this one in December was several months of planning, figuring it out. Obviously, they'd invested more in their security since the first rescue, as you can imagine. And I think the way in which it happened felt a little bit like being in a spy movie. It's not an experience I think I'll ever have again. This, like running across like muddy fields in December, kind of climbing over a barbed wire fence, like crowbarring open a door, and then rescuing dogs. It really was like a prison break in a lot of ways. It was very kind of adrenaline heavy action. And I suppose the biggest regrets coming out of it can kind of be 2 categories. For me, the biggest emotional impact that I felt was that we couldn't rescue more dogs, basically. Like that like experience of like knowing that yes, it's a fundamentally inherently good thing that dogs have been rescued from this place and they are now going to live their full, healthy, happy lives, but also we were never going to be able to rescue every single dog, and every additional dog that we were able to rescue is a good thing, and that we couldn't rescue them all, like, really weighs heavily now. And then I suppose the other category of regrets, like now, for myself, like having been through the whole legal process, having been convicted of burglary and been sentenced for it as well, is that there were things that we could have done to have ensured that the evidence that we gave in court and the story that we presented to the jury was stronger rather than weaker. The t-shirts that we were wearing, for example, saying put animal testing on trial, I think at the time felt like a good thing, but in retrospect, I can see how that came across as using a jury, using a court to further a political message, which is something that the legal system very much hates, no matter what country in the world you're in, and took away from the focus of what this was, which was a rescue attempt. So things like that, I think, are regrets, but ultimately, now nearly 3.5 years down the line, I still believe in the actions that I took. I think it was a fundamentally good thing. It's a shame that we've been convicted, but at the same time, freedom isn't free, and the net benefit for the dogs is a good one, versus the net loss that I've faced as a result of a conviction, I think, is the way that I view it now, which helps me keep my spirits up, I guess.
Yeah. And do you think that it went how you had hoped it would? Did it meet the expectations? Were they realistic?
Yes. So we rescued the amount of dogs that we had secured homes for. Of course, if we'd rescued more dogs, I think arrangements could have been made on the day for those to go into homes. But the big thing that went wrong was there were 2 additional dogs, Love and Libby, who were rescued. They made it out of MBR Acres, but in the process of them getting to eventual safety, they were intercepted by the police and eventually returned to MBR Acres. And I think that was a particularly heartbreaking experience, that those dogs in particular were so close to freedom. But looking back, I think there's very little that could have been put in place to avoid that. These were things that happened very much on the day and couldn't have been foreseen. But it's a guilt and a regret that I think anyone involved in that is going to carry with them. That those 2 dogs, Love and Libby, are almost certainly dead now. These couple of years down the line, whether they were immediately euthanized because they would maybe have been considered, contaminated property for being in the outside world, or whether they eventually ended up in a laboratory somewhere. So that's the big thing that didn't go to plan. But apart from that, it went pretty well, all things considered, which is somewhat surprising. It's a quote from a German general in the Second World War. No battle plan survives contact with the enemy. That kind of idea. But in this case, I think we were able to do what we wanted to do quite effectively on the night.
Yeah, and it's amazing that you can say all that in spite, actually having been convicted. Do you think that the rescue maybe set a precedent for other organizations to carry out open rescues? And do you think there are maybe any legal implications that could come from this for similar charges or UK law in general?
Yes, so open rescue is absolutely fascinating to talk about. And it's actually, like, as a tactic or strategy, whatever you want to call it, did actually originate in Australia. So you guys can take credit for that. I suppose, for anyone who doesn't know it, it's as opposed to a covert rescue, an anonymous rescue where people will go into a farm or an animal testing facility and take animals out and not report it at all. They'll wear balaclavas. They'll do anything possible to prevent themselves from being caught, which I think in itself is laudable. There's inherent gain every time an animal is rescued from death. But in comparison to that, open rescue is deliberately done without hiding one's own identity, the identity of the person doing the rescue, and they are willing to accept the legal consequences of what they are doing. Not flat out. Open rescue is designed in a way that the people involved take it to a trial, which in this country most usually happens in front of a jury, where they argue that what they did was actually a legal thing to do, which we'll get on into a second. The UK has a framework that allows you to argue that. But the idea being that open rescues are capable of inspiring tens, hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of people into doing something similar as well. The stories of these people and these individual animals can be really inspiring to the wider world. But not only that, is what you've already mentioned, is if we design these actions to give the best possible chance of defense arguments in court, we can actually set legal precedent for the rescue of animals as well, which for me is incredibly, pardon me, exciting. So in the law in the UK, theft, which encompasses burglary, like common theft, that sort of thing, has a clause in it that means that it has to be done dishonestly. This is to prevent, the wrongful conviction of someone who perhaps, in many instances, they took something they thought was theirs and it turned out not to be theirs. Having that dishonesty kind of clause in the legislation means that people like that can say, I honestly thought this was mine. But what it also does, and again, this is plain as day written into the legislation, allows you as a person, if you do an open rescue, to say my intentions were honest. Therefore, I did not believe that I was breaking the law to do this. You're not saying to a jury, I broke the law, but I have these excuses. You're fundamentally saying, I did not break the law in taking this course of action. And there is a very interesting legal test in the UK to define honesty, or rather dishonesty, which is two parts. So the first part is where a jury, or if it's in a magistrate's court, a judge is asked to ascertain the actual state of mind of the defendant as to their beliefs about the facts of the situation. So it's basically what was going through their head at the time they took this course of action. And then the second question is, like, given all of this, given their beliefs, would an ordinary and decent person think that their conduct was dishonest? So it's a objective test, which is actually rather of a subjective question for a jury to answer. And I think this is really important in these cases, because ultimately it puts it down to a jury of ordinary and decent people to decide, did they think your course of action was an honest or a dishonest one? And we've seen in our trial, so we've had 3 completed so far. We've had 1 acquittal and 2 convictions. So we have had a jury that has turned around and said, I do not think your actions are dishonest, which is an amazing thing to do. And this is the first time that open rescue has been to trial in the UK. So building on this, I think there's immense scope to build powerful case law in the UK that defines the admissibility of evidence in these kind of cases, that defines the scope, the breadth of defences that people can make, and in the future can perhaps be turned into something that enough of these happen, go through the court system, and hopefully result in not guilty verdicts, that there could be legislation built that in fact gives people the right to rescue animals from these kind of situations, which is something that groups in the US are really pushing for at the moment, is the actual kind of the right to rescue as a law, where animals in situations of distress can be taken and rehomed, and that's not a crime. But also, on the flip side, the law could get worse. The legislation that defines theft, defines burglary, could get changed to exclude these defences. So it's really a double-edged sword. But there's a lot of scope for progress here. And I think one thing that is really inspiring that's coming out of the open rescue strategy at the moment in the US in particular is that now there are being legal appeals filed that habeas corpus, so the right to the right to freedom from unlawful detention, could apply to animals as well. And this would completely change the face of the property rights as animals are concerned, if they become subject to habeas corpus. And even in this country, we had a bill passed through government a few years back, animal sentience bill, for instance. And if you start getting into this kind of territory, which of course open rescue can help power tangentially, where you've got animals who legally have to have their subjective feelings considered, then there is much broader kind of area to be challenging their use in industries like animal testing, for instance, as well. But not all of this can be put down to open rescue, but I think open rescue is going to be a fundamental part in pushing this along, and kind of nudging the law along. And I think that's the approach that Animal Rising takes in a lot of instances, being willing to be bold, a little bit outside the box, and push things to their limits, and see, if it bends or if it breaks in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And in contrast to that potential scope for progress, we actually saw the UK government earlier this year classify animal research and breeding facilities as key national infrastructure, which effectively means restricting or banning peaceful protests outside these locations, with up to 12 months in prison and unlimited fines for offenders. And that seems like a huge step backwards for democracy, not only in attempting to drown out the voices of certain protesters, but actively attempting to shield this kind of animal cruelty from legitimate scrutiny. So do you think that this change in legislation could have been influenced by the beagle rescue or other similar activities?
Yes, certainly. I think it's the classic situation, the dilemma for the government and also for the quote unquote activist as well is, increased action leads to increased repression, which is, a roll of the dice by the government of, is this going to stop people doing what they're doing, or is this going to embolden them to do more and unleash the kind of backlash effect of the general public being so disgusted at the government clamping down on these people that the government has no choice but to roll back on it. But I think the actions at MBR Acres from Animal Rising, from Camp Beagle, as mentioned, and also a campaign that's sprung up over the last couple of years targeting their kind of secondary and tertiary suppliers is almost single-handedly the reason why this legislation has been passed. We've even seen through the Freedom of Information Act requests were made to see details of the meeting between Patrick Vallance, who kind of leads the government's kind of department on science, kind of layman's terms, that he actually met with MBR Acres before proposing that this was put into law in this country. Yeah. So there's very much a paper train there that shows that it's what's happening to MBR Acres has put the whole life sciences sector in the UK on notice, and to use their extensive lobbying capability to get this passed as a piece of legislation, but not without a fight, because originally this was proposed as what is called a statutory instrument, which is like a small amendment to an existing piece of legislation that doesn't require a full vote in the House of Commons. So it was first put into a delegated legislation committee where loads of MPs, after groups like ours wrote to them and encouraged them to challenge it, went and challenged it, which meant that it had to go to the House of Commons for an end of day a ballot, which is basically, if no one opposes to it, it gets passed. MPs turned up and they said, no, like this isn't going to pass without scrutiny. So then it went to a full vote in the House of Commons, which unfortunately did pass, but it wasn't a landslide. It was about 300 and something votes to more than 100 objections to this going through. So there was a massive body of MPs against it, and then it was passed through the House of Lords, and even now there is a judicial review that's been filed against it as well. So it's been challenged at every stage. So I think in this kind of roll of the dice that the government's taken, it's certainly backfiring on them at the moment. And as you say, it just seems at odds with the fact that our government in this country was elected on a manifesto promise to phase out animal testing in 2024. And it's really going to show the links between the kind of pharmaceutical sector, the life sciences sector, and their capacity to lobby government and ministers. But I think you can trace this back probably to when Camp Beagle got set up in 2021. We rescued beagles in 2022, and the MBR suppliers campaign kicked off in the last couple of years as well.
Yeah, it was quite shocking to hear this new change. But do you think that the new legislation could potentially impact the sentencing of those from the rescue who did receive a guilty verdict?
So I think it will be in the back of the mind of judges. We've had 2 sentences now. Sentences ranging from at the worst, which was for me and my co-defendants, where we got an 18-month prison sentence that was suspended for 2 years. So if we commit a new offence in the next 2 years, our sentence will get activated and we will go to prison, alongside 120 hours of community service, and then about £1,000 in compensation costs for the prosecution. That was the high end, and then the low end was a conditional discharge, which is basically, if you do something else in the next year and a half, you can get taken back and sentenced again for this. So I imagine it would have been in the back of mind of the sentencing judges, even though it couldn't have formed a formal part of their sentencing. But I think these sentences stand in a stark difference, actually, to the sentencing that members of SHAC, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, received nearly 20 years ago now. And I think a key difference for that, perhaps, and this is speculation going out on a limb, is the manner in which the actions have been taken. This difference between like open rescue and then like covert operations as well. And I think when groups do things covertly and then get caught, as it were, or their actions involve an element of violence, whether that's towards property or threats to individuals, it then becomes much easier for them and the animal movement to get painted in negative light by a prosecution, by the media, by the government, as opposed to people doing these actions and saying, yeah, I did it because I wanted to rescue dogs, and not hiding from it at all, definitely factors in to this sort of thing.
This episode is made possible by animal-free science advocacy supporters. If you would like to help support the podcast, go to animalfreescienceadvocacy.org.au.
We're actually seeing quite a bit of policy change now in the UK. It is a bit of a hotspot in that regard. Just last year, the government announced a plan to phase out the use of animals in certain tests by 2030. These include skin and eye irritation tests, Botox potency testing, and pharmacokinetic studies with dogs and primates. And instead, the government will inject £75 million, I think it is, into non-animal methods, which they've finally recognised to be safe, effective, and ethical alternatives. And there was a lot of protesting and campaigning and petition signatures and advocacy that drove that change. And we even saw several MPs speak out on it. So with all that in mind, how do you feel about the future of animal testing in the UK? And do you think that this roadmap is going to play out as planned?
Yes, so it's the culmination of several decades of both above and below ground work, I would say. And it was weird because at the time this announcement was made last year, the general reaction, I would say, was one of disappointment, actually. It had taken, since they'd been elected, it had taken the government more than a year to announce this roadmap, even though it was a manifesto pledge. And to a lot of people, it seemed like they were doing things that could have been done years ago, rather than anything that was, like truly breaking the mold and taking a leap forward.
Right, so you were expecting more.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think that it seemed to almost reinforce this status quo. I think all of these changes were made with the caveat of the UK is going to require animal tests for the foreseeable future, which I think is a very dangerous dogma, is what it is to take. I think that science thrives when people question dogma and question the status quo and say, is there a better way to do this? Like that's almost the very basis of scientific development through thousands of years. And taking a stand on saying animal testing is going to be needed, full stop, is a very dangerous one to take. And this isn't an ethical argument, a moral argument whatsoever. It's a rational one. So I think that was deeply concerning to see. But also at the same time, you have to give credit where credit's due. These things are actually happening now. The Labour government that we have has actually put them into place and seems to be following through with them. And £75 million is objectively a lot of money to fund replacements, but you also need to take it with a pinch of salt, because the animal testing industry is receiving like between 300 million, £500 million of taxpayer money every single year for its development. And if we had a government that was serious about full phase out of animal testing, there would be a reversal of that. It would be steadily reducing the amount of money available for animal research and steadily increasing the amount of money for non-animal research as well. So I think that's in the back of the mind of everyone involved. And as I was saying, these changes have simply taken too long to happen. The changes that have happened seem to be great on the surface, but are changes that could have been made before. It's nothing massively new or massively developing the scientific field in that regard. And I think the important thing for everyone involved to do is to not sit on their laurels and to increasingly scrutinize these changes and to make sure that they're actually followed through on. The history of government is a litany of broken promises to people, I think, and by carrying on the pressure and the scrutiny and the observation of the changes that actually are being made ensures that they are made and future changes get made as well. And also viewing this in the context of the political climate, whichever country you're in. Your government may declare that it's going to make change. But if they lose the next election, what's going to happen then? So having this kind of broader view, as well of ensuring that these changes can be made regardless of what government we have in power, whilst also doing this like active political lobbying to try and get the most favourable government in power as well, which is something I think is a blind spot for a lot of organisations who are single issue groups, is they don't care who's in government, they care about talking to who's in government. But if we can broaden the scope of what we're doing into real political change, then more often than not, hopefully we can get a government in power that we want to be in power, that is most amenable to making these changes as well.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that your general sentiment, I guess, comes across as one of a little bit disappointed, because here in Australia, the landscape is so different. The UK has a strong precedent in support of the development of NAMs and the ethical and scientific necessity to do so. Your legislation is stronger than ours, and it actually mandates its funding. In 2023, the government also announced publicly via written questions that there was no mandate to test on animals for pharmaceutical purposes. And then in 2025, announced the £75 million to support a UK centre for validation of alternative methods, as well as the UK policy paper replacing animals in science. And in contrast, Australia has made very little progress in advancing NAMs. We have a national strategy, but no roadmap and no funding, and only a state-based non-animal technology network. What do you think Australia can learn from the UK progress or mistakes?
Yeah, so I was very surprised to learn how poor Australia is in terms of the development of non-animal methods, non-animal testing. I think, very much the rest of the English-speaking world views Australia as a very progressive country in pretty much every regard. So this was a surprise to me. But as far as I can see, I think there seems to be this lack of like strict and centralized scrutiny on animal testing, and this almost academic license to be challenging animal testing on a structural level. But for whatever reason, I think, for example, in the UK, we've had the British Medical Journal has been seriously questioning the use of animal testing since I think 2004, 2005. And this is, a very kind of conservative, recognized body doing that. And it doesn't seem that the same level of scrutiny is coming out of, similarly reputable Australian outlets. And I think this is really essential because it provides an academic foundation for challenging animal testing as well. And it's questioning the status quo. But moving on, I guess, to lessons from the UK as well, from our failures as well, I want to say here, is this kind of, it doesn't have to be direct action, it doesn't have to be breaking the law, but groups being willing to be a bit more bold and out there in what they're asking for. It's theories of change with the ideas of the difference between transformational change, which is this big paradigm shifting asks that reframe the entire conversation, and incremental change campaigning, which is accepting broadly speaking we've got a status quo and we're going to achieve what we can within that. And I think neither is the absolute way of making change. You need both, but when you lean into one of them, you end up giving up something that's incredibly valuable. And I think we've seen that in the UK. Perhaps we've gone too hard on transformational change and we haven't had the infrastructure to make those incremental changes. But perhaps it seems that more broadly speaking, for this kind of ecosystem of groups in Australia working on animal testing, that there is this overcorrection towards incremental change campaigning. And I find it interesting in countries where groups do develop that are willing to make these bold, big, inspiring asks, and how that can have these kind of rebound, positive effects for other groups in the space who aren't asking for as much, but suddenly they have a lot more space to work in, basically. So I think that's one thing that I see that perhaps Australia could benefit, is just having an Animal Rising of its own, who's willing to just completely come in from the side, separate to everyone else, and to be pushing the topic and the conversation even further. Maybe that wouldn't work. I'm not one to comment, but I think it's certainly worth someone giving it a shot. But then I guess from the failures in the UK as well, I not for 1 second would label the animal rights movement of the 1990s and the early 2000s, the likes of Shack and Speak that I've already mentioned, I wouldn't label them a failure by any means, but one of their failures as a group was the image that it gave the animal movement in the UK. And I can completely understand the way they conducted themselves and the actions that they took, given the political climate at the time. But it's very easy for the government and the police and for the animal testing industry to vilify an entire group of people if they are doing things such as arson, threats of arson, threats of criminal damage, things, I think it's kind of, urban myths like old wives' tales, but, going as far as to dig up the dead bodies of family members of animal researchers and dump them in their gardens kind of thing. And at the end of the day, these groups made a lot of progress. They were so close to forcing a lot of the animal testing industry in the UK to shut down through sheer threat and running costs and getting suppliers to pull out contracts. But that came with the massive trade-off of antagonizing the state, the government, and also general people against them. So when the government finally decided to clamp down on the animal movement in the UK in 2007, with dawn raids that resulted in 30 people getting banged up in prison cells, it was very easy for them to tell the public the story of the animal rights movement in the UK is a small fringe group of very aggressive, very violent, unhinged, unscientific people. And it's probably only in the past 2-3 years that general perception has been shed in this country, and people have been more willing to listen to the arguments that animal rights groups are being put forward rather than just dismissing them out of hand for whatever reason. So I think there's a really strong lesson to seriously think about the tactics that we use when we're advocating for change, and to foresee their long-term consequences and the impacts that it can have on the public. Because going back to one of the things I said at the beginning about how a lot of my work is in narrative and how we communicate with people, how we put our messages into the world, if we do that successfully and we have the public on side, governments are more likely to listen to what we have to say. Governments are less likely to clamp down with repression on the animal movement. So really working very hard on carefully curating the image and the perception that people have of your organizations and of your movement feels so much more important to me than has been given credit for. It was interesting hearing, at AFSA, you've put a lot of work into this as well, like the kind of language that you use when you're speaking to people and the impact that it has on people is really important for everyone to be doing. And when you're designing these things, when you're designing how you want to make change in the world, it's like you shouldn't give a damn about what you think in a lot of ways. You need to put yourself fully into the shoes of the person that you're aiming to convince. And I think for a long time, the movement against animal testing in the UK was not doing that. And granted, they were very successful in the tactics that they were using, particularly, targeting, secondary and tertiary suppliers to the animal testing industry, and the actions that they were eventually locked up and put away for nearly collapsed the animal testing industry in the country. But the cost of that was nearly 20 years of, kind of social stigma around anyone who is involved in animal rights, because this was front page news when it was happening. And it's really important to remember that public opinion can, in a lot of times, be the shield from government repression, and on the flip side, can be the driver of governmental change as well.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we can agree with, and definitely a factor in the image and code of conduct that AFSA has committed to. We're definitely an advocacy group, not an activist group. And there are so many stakeholders in the animal testing industry. It is really hard to please everyone and speak in everybody's language. We do obviously have the general public that we need to speak to raise awareness about, to get to rally support, to get behind our campaigns. But we also have a lot of activity within the scientific community, a lot of outreach, speaking with policymakers, and the scope of our activity is so broad. So, changing hats like that and being able to speak with different people by different rationale is quite challenging. And unfortunately, I think that the stigma that you've spoken about is something that most groups, whether they're activist or advocacy based, will have to deal with. And I think that unfortunately, it's something that we see globally, unfortunately. So I think this day and age, everyone working in this space is, quite aware of it and used to it. And we have, some good arguments and strategies to tackle this. But that definitely makes sense and is something that we resonate with. I think that one of the things that we would also like to see happen, because we do see a lot of change in policy just on regulatory testing applications. So we previously mentioned, Botox testing and pharmacokinetic studies, but we would really like to see also some changes in basic biomedical research. So this could be like the bulk of it often is just curiosity-based research. And it really, isn't designed to target any sort of specific health condition or question for humans. So what are we doing it for? And we're really trying to target both of those, and that has been quite a challenge. I'm not sure if you have the answer to that, but we'd definitely like to know how we can advance both of those applications moving forward.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I think that second point in particular was it makes me think of the first time I read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, and the amount of examples he gives in that book of completely needless experiments that were just to satisfy scientific curiosity. They had no greater purpose at all. It seems insane. These things are allowed to happen without a clear purpose, because it's not. In my field in philosophy, you can do this kind of abstract thought experiment stuff, and it doesn't hurt anyone to do it. Some people might say it's a waste of time, but that's their opinion. But there's no actual tangible harm by doing, exercising your curiosity in that kind of field. But in a field where you use actual living beings, the barrier to be doing that seems to be so much lower than it ought to be. But for me, again, it sound like banging the same drum again, is so much of this comes down to narrative and story and how we communicate the message. And alongside that is issue saliency of making this something that people actually care about and they feel is an important reflection on who they are as a people or what their country is as a nation. It was a piece of messaging that was really resonant for us in 2023. Was key repetition of this kind of point of Britain is a nation of animal lovers. The way our country is running right now does not reflect that. Kind of idea of broken relationship with animals and nature. And rather than curating messages that are about an external thing, is adopting a values-based messaging and a values-led messaging framework where everything you're saying prompts someone to have internal reflection about themselves and who they are as a person, and if the situation, the scenario they're being proposed to or being presented with actually fits with who they are as a person. And of course, a message can only be as powerful as many people see it, but designing these messages in a way that they connect with someone on an emotional rather than a rational level a lot of the time. And I feel like I see these kind of research, experimental kind of procedures that have no scientific benefit. I think it's very easy to build a framework that a lot of people can feel utterly outraged by. And the same talking about medical research, things that we already have suitable replacements for, or the replacements just need the funding to perfect them, kind of thing, is really getting out of our own heads and into this frame of what are the values of the audience that I'm speaking to? What is it that resonates with them and makes them feel like something is right or wrong? And I think this kind of like scientific progress, medical improvement, the idea that bad science kills people are all themes that can be explored and developed upon, that are resonant with people. Because if someone turns around to you and says, yeah, I actually just don't care about animals at all, I'm going to continue eating meat for the rest of my life, I don't care whether the medicines that I use are tested on animals or not, as long as they work, then these kind of ethical, moral arguments fall away, which I think for the majority of the grassroots animal organizations that aren't doing a lot of political advocacy, they don't have a comeback to that, because their entire argument is predicated on the person opposite me cares about animals. So it's figuring out how do we speak to that person as well. And the scope of animal testing doesn't save lives, it actually kills people. is a much more resonant argument for that person. And I think there's a huge amount of literature that demonstrates that the animal testing status quo is holding back science. It's not developing it. And then there's just so much more to explore here. But I think for me, it really comes down to the messages that we design and how we deliver them to people in a really high quality way, basically.
Yeah, very interesting. And I'm glad that you say that, because that's definitely the approach that we took in one of our more recent campaigns to end primate testing, appealing to what we believe to be Australian values of kindness and respect, which really underpin exactly what we're lacking in this industry. Coming back to the trials, you've got trials and appeals still looming. So Animal Rising is nonetheless pushing forward with its campaign to shut down MBR Acres. You have a petition I've seen with already over 170,000 signatures. That's very impressive. I would like to know what's next in this space. If your campaign is successful and MBR Acres is shut down and the beagles rehomed, would you continue to target animal research? And if so, which aspect of it?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. And yeah, we're in the middle of the fourth trial out of 5 at the moment. Obviously, fingers crossed for acquittals in this and the last one. And then in terms of legal process, that is mostly over, although the trial that I was in has an appeal ongoing, may be successful, it may not be. It could result in a retrial in that instance. But I think it's coming. I think that we are going to be able to get MBR Acres shut down and the dogs rehomed. I do believe that, regardless of the kind of government clampdown. I think that there's definite progress in the right direction here. And one thing that I'm particularly focused on at the moment is the network that we're building to do this, not evaporating the moment that we succeed. So I think in the future, things look like more organized political advocacy is something we've been dipping our toes in the water. It's something that other groups, like PETA, Animal Free Research, have been doing for a long time in this country, granted, but actually getting to Westminster, talking to politicians, lobbying politicians, leveraging the power that individual constituents can have over their member of parliament as well. Our open letter calling for MBR Acres to get shut down was released just this week, and we've had the public support of dozens of MPs. We've had Green MPs and Labour MPs sharing this on their social media, and that changes the face of the work we're doing to be something that is more acceptable and more respectable without losing the core of the message that we're pushing. And
recently also a few celebrities.
Yes, Joanna Lumley, Jonathan Ross, Amanda Holden, amongst others. And we're in a good position in the UK because we've had something called Herbie's Law kind of being battered around Parliament, being proposed for quite some time. And everything that is related to directly or tangentially to animal testing strengthens the cause for Herbie's Law to at least be debated in Parliament. And there is just a strong framework for that to happen in this country, but it's going to require a lot more coordination than currently exists. I think that it's a common critique of left-wing groups in particular, but I think applies to the animal movement, the social change space as well, is they're more preoccupied with fighting each other than they are with fighting the thing that they want to beat at the end of the day. But coordination between your classic NGO groups, your scientific advocacy groups, individual MPs, grassroots organisation kind of type groups need to be more aligned and more willing to work with each other and to sit down at a table. I think there is a little bit of snobbery that runs in every direction, where everyone thinks they're the group doing the best thing. And at the end of the day, we're going to be strongest when we appreciate the strengths of each individual organization within this kind of movement ecosystem that we have. And I think getting over that barrier is going to be essential to ending animal testing in the UK, but certainly the direction that I think we would be going in after we succeed at shutting down MBR Acres. Because if, touch wood, when that happens, it will be a huge body blow, I'll call it, for animal testing in this country, and it will create this kind of moment of the whirlwind where anything is possible, which is only going to last for a short space of time. So creating and developing this network of change makers who are able to take advantage of that is equally as important as achieving this win as well. But in terms of specifics, I wouldn't be sure because there's a lot of temptation to go after these low-hanging fruit. For example, stopping the importation of primates into the UK for animal testing, which is already ongoing. But then there is the concern that you fall into a version of the small body problem which exists in factory farming campaigns, which is the idea that we advocate for pigs and goats and sheep and cows because they're animals that are perceived as more intelligent and easier to get wins for, and then we forget about chickens in particular. And it's harder to get people to care about chickens, even harder when they already think it's been won because you've achieved a lot of wins for larger animals as well. And I do wonder that if we achieve wins for dogs and for primates, that people are going to suddenly think, oh, we've won, and then forget that the vast majority of animals in testing are, rats, mice, bunnies, these smaller animals that
birds,
are
fish.
harder to get people. Yeah, exactly. That it's very hard to get people to care about those animals.
It is.
On the best of days. And if they already think that the issue's won, they're even going to be less likely to care about it as well.
Yes. The speciesism is definitely an issue that we've come across many times, and we actually touched on it recently because AFSA conducted a national opinion poll just at the end of 2025, and it definitely came through in the numbers that people much more easily identify with dogs, cats, and primates, and less so with fish and rodents and birds and other animals like that. So it is something that we see across the board. However, I think I'm hopeful at least that, like you said, if you can get a few of these through, the lower hanging apples, then it will be easier to argue on the basis of ethical and scientific consistencies the other species too. So fingers crossed, if we can get one win, the momentum will continue and we can get all species included. On that note, what would you like people here in Australia to learn from your campaign, and how do you think they should act on it?
Yeah, so I don't think we've done everything perfectly. Things have gone wrong along the way, but I think that the true value in a lot of this has been the lessons that we've learned and we're able to implement our work and give to other people as well. And I think going back to, firstly, one thing I said earlier is like this willingness to be brave and to be bold. And it doesn't have to be every organization all the time doing this. It's very much recognizing that the work we're doing is within the context of this ecosystem of different groups who want the same thing to happen and have a bit of a different way of getting there. And for that ecosystem to thrive, I think does require groups who are willing to do these big, bold, high risk, high reward kind of actions, or adopt, the very bold messaging to push the boundaries, the envelope of what is considered an acceptable conversation in this area. And I think that's something that is lacking, not only in Australia, but in large parts of the world, where the dominant theory of change is an effective altruist one, and everything else seems to have been thrown out the window. So it's kind of like two-part kind of learning of someone needs to be bold and brave and go all in on something, but also that needs to be done within the context of a movement ecosystem where other groups are able to step in and make the concrete gains, whilst that opportunity exists. The idea of the inside-outside game that kind of popularized through a lot of like US like social movements in the 20th century is that the outside game is creating the opportunities that the inside game can take advantage of. And if those two components don't exist, then things are being done in vain, and they're best when they work together. And also this last one of like, again, is like really upskilling and evolving the stories that we're telling the world and how we're putting our message into the world. And it's work that's been ongoing in the UK with the creation of Animal Think Tank in 2017 as kind of this dedicated research body to identifying what messages work and what messages don't, and kind of professionalizing, I guess, the way we do it. I think there's a real stigma in the grassroots space, especially you're more like direct action, civil disobedience people. Anything that is professional in any capacity is sacrificing, part of what that group is about. But there are some things that we ought to professionalize on, and the way we message, the way we tell our story is absolutely one of those. So really investing, months at a time in developing these stories, because that's something that we didn't do before the rescue in December, with the whole kind of narrative of put animal testing on trial that sounded great initially and we ran with it, but down the line has caused us a lot of problems, and something we wouldn't do if we had the opportunity to go back. But if we had a space where we were like really designing that message, maybe we wouldn't have adopted it, because we would have foreseen the issues that it would have thrown up. So I think, yeah, that's kind of my mixture of like how we organize, needing someone to be bold and brave and really like go at the heart of things, but also to do so in a way that is thought out and actually makes sense to the people who that messaging is being directed to, rather than just going in with the classic kind of activist mentality of I am right, you're wrong, and I don't care what you have to say. As well is really thinking about the message that's designed, as well as being bold and brave and like Vanguard-esque with it as well.
Yeah, very practical advice there. Thank you so much, Nathan, for taking the time to talk to us. You and the whole team at Animal Rising have shown such courage and commitment. It's truly inspiring, and we wish you all the best with the campaign and, of course, the trials. If anyone is interested in learning more about the campaign, head to www.animalrising.org. I am sure there are going to be many more exciting updates to come in this space. And locally, AFSA is continuing a similar fight to have research dogs and cats rehomed in our Right to Release campaign, which you can read more of on our website at animalfreesci.org.au. Thanks for listening.